All right, well, thank you. And this module is going to be focusing on this methodology that Mark referred to for the assignment of offense gravity score, really our descriptive approach, where we look at historical sentencing data and utilize that to calculate these distributions, but more specifically, the median sentence, and look at really the range and type of dispositions and the durations of these sentences to see how we might assign these different offense types to the new OGS matrix that Mark mentioned. So just really briefly, as been discussed, that an offense gravity score is assigned to each offense based on the elements of the conviction offense and the classification of the crime. In the current matrix, we have, as Mark noted, 14 OGS categories on vertical axes, going from 1 at the bottom, the least severe, to 14 at the top. And these are divided into these 5 sentencing levels. And we make use now of these omnibus assignments for offenses that are otherwise not listed or new offenses to be thinking about where to place new offenses onto this matrix, so that, for example, an F1 offense might receive an omnibus offense gravity score of 8. An M1 might receive an OGS category of 3. While this is useful, clearly, if you develop a new matrix with a lot more categories, we need to rethink where to classify these things. And I think also one of the strengths, as Mark mentioned, about expanding the number of OGS categories is we might have at a specific OGS category now a number of different offenses that are in fact not that similar grouped together in OGS 5 or OGS 7, and we know there's broad recommendations within those individual cells for those OGS categories, and allowing for and accommodating for a broad range, like Mark mentioned, from restorative sanctions up to 9 months even of confinement within that same cell. So we need to, by creating a newer matrix that has these 35 OGS categories, we're going to now think about the process where we made assign these. And this figure, just so you could see, is the handout, but since it's so big, I split it in 2. But we have 6 sentencing levels, from level A being restorative sanctions. And as Mark mentioned, we have a refined set of levels for probation. And we'll get into specifics about the actual matrix and the intersection of OGS and PRS later in today's presentations. But this then goes all the way up to state confinement. And you could see there's a lot of OGS categories, or an expanded OGS set of categories for these different levels in this proposed. One idea we had was to focus solely on one specific offense type as an exemplar, and we're looking at burglary, so Title 18, Chapter 3502. And we're going to run through and look at 6 specific offense types within burglary, ranging from burglary, which is not a house and no person present, all the way up to a home invasion and bodily injury as exemplars. So we could take these, and there's obviously, as Mark's talked about also, is this idea of proportionality. We're going to discuss how these may relate to one another from both a descriptive and a prescriptive way. There are a couple things to take into account that we'll get into here, which is, from the descriptive side, how many cases do we need to be actually able to draw an understanding of what the true median is? So if we have 250 cases, we might have a lot of confidence in that. If we have 6 cases, how representative of the typical offense are those 6 cases, or the typical sentence? So we're going to be balancing this and talking about a process that takes that into consideration. And in this range of burglary offenses here, there are those with large number of cases and those with very small cases. And we'll talk through some of that process. So we'll start with 3502A4, which is a person commits the offense of burglary and enters a occupied structure that is not adapted for overnight accommodation, which at the time of the offense, no person is present. So we could think of this as not a house and no person present. So our starting point is to take a look at our old matrix and just see where that falls. And currently, this is an offense with OGS equals 5. It's an F2. And the standard range for that offense, looking at prior record score 0, is restorative sanctions through 9 months of confinement. What we did was we looked at data from 2019 or sentences imposed, and we looked at the most serious offense in a criminal incident to develop this descriptive profile. And you'll notice that we plotted this from starting with restorative sanctions, and then there's a period of probation, and then it leads into confinement with months. And we do not make a distinction here other than duration of the months, whether it's county or state incarceration or state incarceration with the county exception, or restrictive conditions of probation. But that will be part of that, as Mark said, identifying where in our ranges are, what assignment we'll make will correspond with those levels, which have a dispositional type recommended with them on our matrix itself. I'll also note that the x-axes, the numbers on the bottom there, correspond with the lower limit of the standard range of our matrices. So if we were to look, for example, at OGS 19, there'd be, on that would be 12 months. The previous one at OGS 18, the lower limit is 9 months. So we're seeing how this would impose itself upon the new matrices, at least in terms of the durations of the sentence. So the first thing just to notice is that the median is 4 months. So there's quite a spread here of sentences. We see that individuals for this 3502A4 receive restorative sanctions, and some individuals receive 36 months of confinement. So we have a broad range of actual sentences that occur. Mark mentioned this idea of a mode, which is the most frequent of these. So we see that the most frequent sentence is greater than 36 months of probation. But it should be noted that we have 161 sentences, and that mode is less than 30. So we're not talking about like a super majority here are receiving greater than 36 months of probation. It just happens to be the most common sentence. And we're also combining folks who get 48 months, 60 months into one category here. So again, we have this distribution, and we can then view where the median rests, and it's 4 months.
If I could just point out one other thing. If you look at that chart, Matt talked about the one median being greater than 36 months of probation, but this is sort of bimodal. So there's 2 modes. The second one is 9 months of confinement. So this is another example where the mode can sometimes be helpful to see like where do the numbers lie, but at other times it doesn't help you to figure out a single typical sentence. And that's where the median, the midpoint, is sort of useful for that. Let me just mention one other thing about the mode, though, that can be helpful to the commission. Back in the early 80s, when the commission was first developing guidelines, we used AOPC data from like 1977 to look at the distribution of sentences. And they looked at burglary. And at the time, all burglaries were felony 1s, and there weren't any distinctions in statute. You went into a place you weren't supposed to go with the intent to commit a crime. But when the commission looked at the data, the commission found 4 spikes like that. So it was, quad modal or whatever. And And when the commission dug into it, what they found was it was based on house and person present. So at the high end was house and person present, and low end, no house, no person present. And the commission, based on that, decided to subcategorize. They said the elements are in place, but there's no distinction at conviction, at least in the 1980s. So in the guidelines, they created 4 different categories of burglary based on what they viewed as sentencing factors: house, person present. And so they came up with these 4 different flavors of burglary and had 4 different recommendations as a result for burglary. And then I think during the special session on crime, or sometime around then, there was an effort to create the felony 2 burglary that could be used for county IP. And then the felony, the house person present, was a crime of violence. And so it was then incorporated into statute. But for a long period of time, it was basically a sentencing factor. So these are some of the things we're going to be talking to you about in terms of the first cut is to think about the elements of the crime and to look at the data and how that plays out. And that's what Matt's talking about. But the second part is when there's no data or it's all over the map, how do you use your judgment to sort of figure out what to do with that? Is it that there are spikes and there might be ways of subcategorizing the offense? Or do we find something that's just a really common reason for, a different kind of sentence and use that as a common thing, like a deadly weapon enhancement? So those are the things we'll be walking through. Thanks.
All right, and also before I move forward, I just want to highlight this handout that was provided to you. This handout, which has a small one, both sides with numbers, includes the data for these exemplars. So for this F2A4 offense, it's the 5th one down, and there's 2 sides to this sheet. We have on one side, it says Philadelphia urban and rural. What we did was we took a look at the overall, all the sentences, and then we wanted to see if there was differences between Philadelphia urban and rural. And some of this extra information would allow us maybe to unpack or to really see if these spikes are driven by particular areas across the Commonwealth, or if we should be thinking about it differently. And you'll note that there's a lot of commonalities or similarities, but one thing to note here is the ends, which is the number of cases, drops off quickly when we start looking at smaller case types, when we start cutting it into these things. The other side, we looked at race, and we wanted to look at the same set of information by total, by white, and by black. Again, this is some information that we can utilize when looking at this from the prescriptive approach, utilizing some of this descriptive information. But on the left side is, it tells us the grade, the OGS, and the standard range, if just for reference. I'm going to be focusing almost exclusively on the total here in this introduction or overview of the methodology.
One question, what's urban?
Go ahead.
Sure. We use the definition from the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. And so it looks at density in the county. And I think Diane might be able to tell us the breakout, but as I recall, the urban counties included, I think it was about 12 or 15 counties. So it was Philadelphia, Allegheny, suburban ring counties in Philly, and then a bunch of the class 3 counties. So I think Dauphin, Lancaster, York, Reading, Berks were urban counties in that breakout, but
So it's by county, it's not.
it's
broken
by
down like
county.
Harrisburg versus.
No,
another
it's
part.
by county. It's whether the county made the cut or not. And that's the Center for Rural Pennsylvania definition.
Okay.
Diane, do you remember the number of counties in each category?
I'm not sure the numbers. I'd have to look, but I have their definition up.
Okay. I got-
284 persons per square mile.
Okay,
I think
that's
it's,
good. Thanks.
I think it's 20 counties, Mark.
20.
Yeah, there's
Okay.
19 urban counties, 48 rural.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And Matt, just so I'm looking at that data, the median, if I'm looking at Philly, the median confinement term there, and I realize the N is low, 12, is 8.7 as opposed to 3.2 urban, 6 months rural. So actually, I mean, Philly's getting a longer sentence
At least for the
For that.
median
for the
of,
median.
yes.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a good point. We would have arrayed all the sentences similar to this for these grouping and picked the midpoint, not necessarily the average represented as the mean of the confinement terms. But I think you make one point that I'll just reemphasize, which is it is worth paying attention to those sample sizes. So 12, we'll talk about what's an acceptable number later as we move forward. Okay, so what we were able to do also, just to give this some context, is to take a look at which of these current sentences fall within the standard range. And we see in this exemplar that 77% of the cases fall within the standard range, or 77% of the sentences rather. And that's because of this broad range of restorative sanctions through 9 months being the standard range. And when we look at the aggravated range, this is plus or minus 3 months, brings us up to 12 months. We had an additional 11%. And then we see a few upward departures of sentences that are 16, 24, or 36 months in duration. So as a next step, we take this median and we begin to think how we would plug it into our new matrix. And so we're looking here at OGS 11, 12, and 13 in our level C. So to make it easier to see, I just blew up those 3 cells. And why do we choose these 3? So since the median is 4 months, these values represent the standard range. These are the standard ranges where 4 months are included in the standard range. So at OGS 11, it's the upper end of the standard range. OGS 12, it's the midpoint of the standard range. And at OGS 13, it's the lower limit of the standard range. So one of the questions is, which of these might we choose? How do we select? Do we want OGS 11, OGS 12, or OGS 13 as our starting? And for illustrative purposes, I chose the lower limit of the standard range, that it would be in this one, the classification, we would assign this to OGS 13. So I think one thing for discussion or conversation, just briefly, if anyone had any insights, is how might we consider which of those 3 options that would make the most sense for selecting the appropriate OGS assignment based on the fact that we have these smaller ranges, and there'll be situations where there'll be several OGS categories that includes the median within the standard range assignment.
If I may, real quick, I apologize for arriving late, had something I had to deal with this morning unexpectedly. But just so I know, are we methodically going through each crime? Is that how this is working? Or are we discussing generally?
Sure. So this is as Mark termed it, a boot camp to really look at just the methodology. Mark did some counting and there were about 2,300 to consider. So I did some math. If we spent 3 minutes on average per group,
Sure.
we'd spend 100+ hours on this exercise. So we want to come up with some guidelines or some approaches for us to consider that the commission staff can make some assignments and then bring back some information, of course, and share with this group, especially with an eye towards that prescriptive and versus the descriptive. So we're
Okay.
looking for some guidance on some decision rules that we might utilize. One decision rule would be to assign it where the lower limit of the standard range is where the median falls.
So Matt, perhaps you said this, but all this data is individuals with the same prior record score? Of
Exactly.
0?
So PRS 0, this does not include any enhancements. So we're looking at what we're saying, the base offense to make comparisons.
If I can just jump in for DA Sunday. So the first section was just talking broadly about what we're looking to do. And then my understanding is I think we're going to take 3 separate crimes just to see what it looks like. We're talking about prescriptive versus prescriptive and how it would plug in and the considerations to be made. And then we're moving on. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're kind of going to powwow and say, where do we go from here?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yep.
I appreciate that.
Okay, so in the next step, again, taking the lower limit of the standard range as our starting point with OGS equal 13. I wanted to also understand or think about what the aggravated and mitigated ranges are. And as Mark mentioned, on the far right of our new matrix, we have this step up or step down approach. And so it's suggesting that it's plus or minus 2 steps. So even though our ranges are tighter, the aggravated mitigated range here would go from a lower limit of 2 at OGS 11 to an upper limit of the standard range of 8 for OGS 15. So it really is 2 to 8 months would be the aggravated mitigated range, even though we have a tighter standard range of 4 to 6 months as the assignment. And as I mentioned also, this would be a recommendation here in this green, darker green of county confinement for the disposition type. So I think what we're going to do is walk through a number of these for different types of burglary, but a couple key concepts is we have the median. We're looking at the percentage that fall within the standard range of the current matrix. Then we look at the aggravated mitigated range, and then we see where this plugs into the new grid. And we're going to think about also not just the standard range, but this aggravated mitigated range. And so this is a type of process that we can undertake from a descriptive approach for all the offenses that we would like, using, again, this historical sentencing data that we have. Okay, so before I go to the next one, and we'll build on each one and it'll probably go quicker through each one, but any questions about really our basic approach and how we're utilizing that median sentence as a starting point for thinking about the classification?
I have a question, which is maybe tangential at best, but so feel free to say that you're going to cover this later. In terms of acceptance of responsibility, like a guilty plea versus either a bench or a jury trial, things like that, how is that contemplated? Is that expressly contemplated in our current guidelines? And how would that fit into the new paradigm?
It is not in our current guidelines, and it is proposed as a factor that could be included in the new guidelines. And if it was, one step decrease or something like that, it's a really good issue in terms of, is this an appropriate baseline? Because these data we excluded in enhancements, we excluded inchoates, and it's 0 prior record score, but blended into that are a lot of negotiated pleas, a lot of substantial assistance, and other things like that that we're thinking about as factors that would be like a one-step discount. And so that gets to Matt's issue about which cell do you pick? If you have 3 to pick from, do you start at the lowest one? Do you start at the highest one? Do you start at the midpoint? Because that may influence what you do there.
And so are you contemplating a one-step decrease from whatever the base OGS is, or are you talking about a step decrease below the mitigated OGS, which would be, I guess, 3 steps below?
No, it would be, so what we're coming up with is basically an OGS number, so 13 or something like that, not aggravated mitigated. And then we would, let's say we say there's a one-step decrease for substantial assistance. So it goes from a 13 to a 12. Then you build the aggravated mitigated around that. So it shifts everything down one block.
Got it. Okay. Thank
Chairman
you.
Stevens, if I may add, oftentimes as a practical matter, that's considered as a mitigating factor, the acceptance of guilt. and that would reduce the sentence as well.
And one of the things that we've talked about throughout this process is when you have a really common event, when you have a really common use of something, or that reason continues to be used as a reason for mitigation, why not build it into the guidelines and basically codify that? Say, okay, that's a one-step decrease. So it's no longer a mitigated sentence because you've basically built it in as a one-step decrease. So you've taken mitigation off and you've said, now we know why that's that value.
Yeah, I think that I agree. I think there should be some standardization for that, just because I know that many counties handle it differently. I mean, the judge just mentioned a mitigated sentence. In Montgomery County, when I was there, I mean, your typical offender, we were starting at the bottom end of the standard range. I mean, that was just sort of the de facto plea offer was, okay, bottom end of the standard range. And if you weren't going to accept that deal, then obviously there was going to, the prosecutor was going to seek a sentence, more within the middle or even to the upper end of the standard range. But there just seems to be so much variability across the counties that it would be good to have some type of a standard in place, I think. Sorry, I didn't mean to derail the conversation, but as well as we were talking about where these ranges are going, I thought it was helpful.
If I may, real sort of pulling it back. So when I look at the screen right now, what I'm seeing is what currently is offense or is would be a guideline range of what is 3 to 12, right? Like that's what as right now is 3 to 12. And what's on the screen right now.
No.
Was it
RS
RS9?
to RS to 9.
So this is burglary, person. Okay, I got you.
Not a house minute. This is the felony 2.
Okay.
Yep.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
The geeky science question. You'll have to explain to me. So I guess when we're looking at descriptive, we're looking at the median when it's statistically significant, right? So you said there's a number by which after that point, it really isn't. And can you give us some idea of what that looks like?
Sure. So we'll have an example later that has 4 cases. So taking the median of 4, maybe the median is the true value we should think about, but I think, it probably degrades as you get closer to an N of 20.
Okay.
But then we have problems when you start doing urban, rural, but where that guidance is also what the distribution looks like. So if you have 15 cases and they're all clustered really tight, that may give us some insight. So I'm not sure there's a official golden rule of when it's applicable or not, other than when it's really low. It may give us some insights and some guidance, but we probably need to be thinking about it. And I'll show an example later, comparing it to other similar offenses or to the current OGS classifications to get some insight into where they fall relative to one another.
And Matt, RC, I assume is restrictive conditions probation, or am I wrong? about that?
Yes.
That's correct. Yes.
So this would also include then non-confinement sentence.
Right. What we did was we treated restrictive conditions or county IP, the restrictive intermediate punishments, as minimum periods of confinement. So if it was 3 months of house arrest and electronic monitoring, we included that as 3 months of confinement because it was restrictive. And you'll see that when we get to recommendations, we sort of follow that pattern of if someone has probation, the way we increase the intensity is to add restrictive conditions rather than move them to jail. So we'll talk more about that.
Yeah. So just looking overall at the grid,
Mhm.
level B, I guess it is, in the proposal, probation does not include house arrests. That wouldn't fall under a probation category, fall under level C.
Well, there's actually 2 different sort of approaches. If someone is on probation and has a prior record score, or you're looking to enhance or aggravate the sentence, you can add restrictive conditions. If someone is in jail, the recommendation for, I guess, C for jail, you can trade off day for day restrictive conditions
Like
for
IP used to be.
confinement. Yep.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Just had another quick question. Just on the question about which starting tier to use between lower, middle, or high, has there been any analysis done on which tier historically has resulted in the best outcomes in regards to like rehabilitation, deterrence, public safety, et cetera?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we have that refined decision. We're even struggling to make that based on the disposition, not the duration. But I think the discussion with the rep earlier regarding like what this number is derived from, we know there's a lot of negotiated pleas in this. And if we're going to take that and use that as a discount basically on the OGS, as Judge Tucker said, then we'd expect that would be off the table in terms of being used as a mitigating reason. But then you're going to be codifying it in effect. You're going to be structuring it into the guidelines. So you'd be promoting that as a part of the guidelines.
Okay, we'll move to another example now for A2, where it's a home, burglary of a home, but no person is present. So this is currently OGS 7 with a standard range of 6 to 14 months and plus or minus 6 months for the aggravated mitigated range, a felony 1 offense. We get a little bit of a different distribution here with a median of 7.5 months. So we already see the fact that by moving to a home as opposed to no home, that the median has gone up from 4 to 7.5 months. Think about this relative approach of what the sentences are. Similar, the range is from close to RS to 30 here, where we had RS and we had a couple sentences of 36 months previously. The N here, the number of cases is roughly 194 cases. So this provides us with enough information here to take a look at this distribution, have some confidence. 59% of the sentences are within the standard range of 6 to 14 months. An additional 33% are within the mitigated range, 5% in the aggravated range, and just a small number of upward departures here of 24 or 30 months in confinement. So in this example, we have 2 OGS categories on the new matrix of OGS 16 and OGS 15 that correspond with the 7.5 months. So we see it falling within between 6 and 8 or between the 7 and 9. We took the midpoint one here or closer where it's OGS 15 as an example. And we could see that, again, in this aggravated mitigated step approach, that the aggravated mitigated range would be from 4 to 10 months if we did the 2 steps down and the 2 steps up using OGS 15 with a standard range of 6 to 8 months. So in this, just as a quick summary in comparison, and we'll do one more offense and then compare the 3 of them just to take a quick look, but relative to not a home, no person present, we see that the OGS assignment would increase because of that median sentence, which would be, I think, consistent with our prescriptive approach, not just the descriptive, what we might expect. So now we look at 3502A1II, which is a burglary of a home with the person present. This is currently an OGS 9 with a standard range of 12 to 24 months, felony 1. And we see this distribution with a tighter clustering around the 9 to 12 month of confinement, and the N here is 60 months. And our median is 11.9 months. We have a lot of sentences that are for during a recommendation of county confinement here that gives us the minimum sentence recommendation of 11.9 months. So the standard range the median is actually below the standard range in this example. We only see 30% of the sentences within the standard range, but we see a lot of the sentences within this mitigated range, indicating again, maybe this desire for county confinement opposed to state confinement.
Yeah, and this might be an example of prescriptive guidelines. Back during the special session on crime, one of the considerations was increasing the offense gravity score for burglary of a house person present because it was a crime of violence. And because of that, we moved it up to make sure that the presumptive guideline recommendation was state prison. So that's why it's in a range. That's why it's an OGS 9. It starts at 12 months. So presumptively it's state prison. But that was higher than the typical sentences imposed for that. So we would have assigned an OGS 8 for burglary of a house person present based on the data. But the special session on crime and making it a crime of violence, we moved it to a 9. And we've kept it there. But there's still this tendency to think in terms of a county jail sentence. And so as Matt said, it's not that judges are flying to a 9. What they're doing is staying under a 12. So they're doing a 1 year less 1 day or an 11.5 month minimum term to keep it in a county jail. There's still plenty of state sentences for that burglary, but the median is at the county level. So that's as much a reflection of the commission making a policy decision, but the data not quite squaring with.
And I want to point out for this particular bar here, where it says 9 is probably the one that needs a little explanation. It actually includes sentences that are greater than equal to 9 months, but less than 12. So while it looks like the mode is 9 months, in fact, you see that it includes, there's 3 sentences of 9 months, and then all these others that are approaching 12 months, but not equaling 12 months. So we see that the median now makes a little more sense being at that 11.9 value. So if we take that again as our starting point, we can come to OGS 18, which this median of 11.9 and that extra data we just saw falls between greater than or equal to 9, but less than 12 months for an OGS assignment of 18 using our descriptive data.
And this is just, the same example again of the starting point of information we would provide to the commission if we did the descriptive would be a recommendation of 18. And then the commission would have to decide from a policy point of view, because it's a crime of violence, should it be a 19 so that the standard range requires or recommends state prison. And that was a decision the commission adopted in the past, and you'd have a revisit of that. But that's the sort of the blending of descriptive data to use it as a starting point, and then prescriptive in terms of the commission making a policy decision.
A couple quick questions. So were you to put it here as an OGS of 18, that gives us the example of on the aggravated mitigated when we're within the same cell, or I don't know, the same color, we can go up or down 2. When we're on the fence getting ready to hop up to another level, we just hop up 1. So if we opted hypothetically to leave this in 18, if you wanted to go within the guidelines but aggravated, you're pumping up to 19. If you wanted to drop down, then you can go 2 down. Okay. And the other question I just had was, in these 3 examples, for the median, when you made decisions about what OGS to assign, I know these are examples only, but I was curious just in that burglary, not home, no person present, you took the median and you selected the OGS where the bottom of the standard guideline range was represented as that number. And the other 2, you picked where the median represents sort of the close to the highest end of the standard. Is that because you look at the surrounding data of the things that aren't falling in and where they're tipping you?
So if we take this as an example, and the first example, if you remember, that 4 months fell into 3 cells, 2 to 4, 3 5, I think, and 4 to 6. And this current one here, 11.9 actually only falls within the OGS of 18. There are not multiple choices, if you would, where the median falls within that. So I think the other example was similar. There were 2 examples that it would fit within. So the choice set depends on what the median is and where it's falling on the OGS category. So here, I'm not saying we didn't have other choices, but from a descriptive approach, OGS 18 fits the description of the data with the median happens to be approaching the upper end of the standard range, but there's no other place that it would fit from a descriptive perspective.
And on our first example, where it was a 4, there's 3 slots, and we selected the one and put it up to the highest end of the 3 slots. So I just wondered if the other one's kind of on the lowest end of the OGS, was that just for descriptive purposes?
Yeah, I mean, we were, that was why I and probably was too early in the conversation to seek guidance on that, of which of those, when it's the upper end of the standard range, it's the midpoint of the standard range, or the lower limit of the standard range, which of those 3 alternatives the commission would like us to consider when making those assignments. So there are, again, from a descriptive point in that 4-month example, the first one, 3 solutions that fit the descriptive approach, and we need a little bit of guidance on which of those makes them. So we can revisit that. Let me just try to forge ahead on, because a couple more examples here. And so I think what's nice about these 3, at least from the descriptive approach, where the ends were somewhat high, is we would think this is the rank order, and it's consistent with the current OGS assignments of 5, 7, and 9 as we move to our new placement on where they may fall. So we've focused on these 3, and there are 3 other burglary offenses that we have not talked about, and I'll go through them relatively quickly. I think at least 2 of them. So we have home invasion and a bodily injury here as A1I. This is an OGS 10 with the standard range of 22 to 36 months, plus or minus 12. This is an illustration where the N is 16 cases, and we see a spread of cases, but this is another example, what Mark referred to, where the median is less than the standard range, and we have a median of 18 months here. So most of the sentences are running from, let's say, 8 to 48 months confinement. So when we come to our layout here, at least relative to the other offenses, again with OGS 10, it fits. And one of the prescriptive questions then is, where would the appropriate assignment be? Do we utilize that median? Is that enough of data and information for us to make this assignment? And I think intuitively, this gives us some guidance where we could utilize that median as a starting point to be thinking about that particular OGS assignment. So we see that fitting somewhere in the top range there of maybe it's, we would give it an OGS of 20 as an assignment. Okay, moving to not a home, but person present. So this is A3. So we looked before at a home, no person present. Now it's not a home, but the person is present. This is an OGS 6, 3 to 12 months standard range. We only had an N of 6, but the median is 9 months. And we see a range of some probation and then some confinement sentence. So when we put this here of 9 months, we see now that the current OGS assignments are out of order, at least when it relates to the median. So we see OGS 5, OGS 7 for a home, no person present. Not a home, but a person present is an OGS 6 currently, and then home person present is an OGS 9. So it brings up some of the question. Mark had a slide that he didn't mention talking about North Carolina that had a ranking of, I think it went person, property, community was the way they considered the rank order. And here we're seeing that maybe person, even though the old OGS assignment didn't consider that above the home, again, the N is small, but it's certainly a prescriptive type of conversation that we would want to have with the commission to where to appropriately assign this relative to the other offenses to ensure the proportionality.
Yeah, and there might be some staying power in this, although the number is small. When we met with the strategic planning work group, we did the same kind of thing with earlier data. And I sort of recall we had this same flip that judges tended to give longer sentences when a person was involved rather than the invasion of the house kind of thing or entering the house. And so, it could be that the view of that burglary has changed from what traditionally was recommended by the commission. And, this is an example of, maybe we do a couple more years of data. We look at some other kind of factors and see how this plays out. But this is the kind of thing we would bring to the commission and say, this is different than what you have in place right now. Is it worth considering, especially given the small numbers?
So again, I think what's nice about the methodology as an approach is it allows one to compare to the other types of similar offenses and the old OGS assignments and to consider the relative placement of them in relationship to where the medians are in our descriptive data. So I'll end on this last one, which is very simple because we have no data. And this is the A4, but when it involves a theft of drugs. So not a home, no person present. So instead of being a felony 2 offense, it's a felony 1 offense. And currently classified as an OGS 7. And again, thinking relative to where A4 was and where our A2 is, which is also an OGS 7, thinking about where to place that from in this case, most likely prescriptive, but relying on the descriptive components of the other offense types. So I know that was a lot of information, but really what we wanted to showcase in this module or session was that we are taking historical sentencing data, in this case, 2019 sentencing data, as Mark said, for prior record scores 0, no enhancements, no inchoates, and mapping out what the actual sentences that were given for particular offense types. We look at the current assignments for a little bit of guidance, what the standard range is, and then we're utilizing our new matrix by looking at those median sentences, as well as similarly or similar type of offenses and where we might assign them onto this a new matrix, also considering this step up, step down, or the aggravated and mitigated ranges, which give it a much wider range than just the standard ranges are presented in each cell. But it allows for this nuanced differentiation across different OGS categories that is, I think, much more refined than the current that, as I mentioned, might have a group of offenses within it, let's say OGS 5, which are in fact not that similar, but because of the width of the standard range, it allows for them to be in that assignment, not giving a lot of guidance for judges and leading to maybe disproportionality of sentences for those type of offenses. So I think we, unless there are any comments on this module, come to a spot where we could take our second break.
Real quick, Matt. So if I'm understanding this right, just take the 2 OGS 7 rates of 15. So a mitigated range could go up to 17, or not mitigated, aggravated range.
That's correct.
Okay, so basically, under the current guideline, it impose a state prison sentence. Under the new guideline for aggravated, we can't. It only goes to 10 months.
I mean, you still could, of course.
Right, I'm saying,
yes.
but even an aggravated range sentence doesn't say prison.
Correct. So I think one thing just to highlight for A2 again is is that from a descriptive approach, a lot of the data falls from below the state sentence. So
Yeah.
majority are to the left of that state sentence. So but if we included the 12 months, doing some math here, roughly 90% fall within from 12 months or below.
Matt, and I hate to harp on, I know we want to take a break, but I think sort of to Judge's previous question, on this, the first one, you plugged in the 4 months and made it 4 to 6 as the starting point for our, here though, where the median's 7.5, you're not plugging it in at 16 where it's 7 to 9, you plugged it in at 15, 6 to 8. Why did you do this one different than the other?
And I think I was just showcasing there are different
Ways of
decision
doing it.
rules,
Okay.
so
All right.
hoping to get a little bit of guidance. And I think in the next section, Mark can continue this conversation, but with poets and enhancements and factors and other elements, but we could talk about that assignment.
Matt, I have one last question. I know we want to be firm and strong on the methodology. How confident and firm are we on these numbers, on the OGS number? Looking at the disparities from urban and rural, and even in the rural areas, from county to county and from the urban. I mean, how are we really firm? Are we rock solid, or are we kind of in a wash? And my concern is whatever we do, it should be on rock. It should be firm. But what I'm feeling is not that. So if you could just explain, if we aren't, we aren't. But if you just could explain how firm are we on the OGS numbers in terms of attributing them to the various crimes?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, as Mark noted in this introduction, but really emphasized last time, that in the past, when the guidelines themselves were developed originally, it was all prescriptive and there was not any data which hang this descriptive piece. So we think that, you know, especially when these sample size, what I call N, are high enough, that it gives us a really good starting point to base it on descriptive, from which then to rely on this prescriptive. So of course, you know, when you have all these different counties with different practices, we're going to see a range of sentences that we see. But for the most part, they're relatively clustered and give us some guidance on the direction to go. So I do think by picking the median, you're hoping that that's the typical sentence and not saying the harsh ones on one end, the lighter ones on the other. It's the midpoint of the full set of sentences. So from my perspective, it is a great foundation as a starting point. We get a little slipperier when those ends go down and you see the example with 16, or there are other examples later with 4 cases, how much validity to give to the median of a very small number of sentences without paying attention again where they're coming from. Are they from urban or rural? So I think there's a lot of information for us to triangulate as staff when we're making these initial assignments, but really relying on the descriptive data. This historical practice is a great start. And I think what Mark alluded to as well, we can overcome some of those small sample sizes by maybe including additional years to increase the number of sentences that we're looking at. So if there were 16, maybe we look at 3 years, we now have 50 cases. Hopefully that sentencing practices are similar between those years. We wouldn't have reason not to.
Has this issue ever been, to your knowledge, challenged in any appellate court?
No, I'm not aware of any challenge to that. But Judge, I think you raise a good point. I agree with Matt, but I also, you know, recognize that there can be, you know, underreporting of sentences. There can be other things like that you know, sort of escape the review of this. So I think we have to be, you know, at least a bit modest in terms of using this as a starting point, and Matt talked about this before, but I think it's a really good point in terms of if something doesn't look right, like unpacking the data, like looking at a full distribution and seeing, is that median sort of, it is the midpoint, but if there's a whole bunch of, outliers at the one end, it's sort of skewed in one direction, does that give us pause, or is that worth the commission looking at and making a different consideration? Or if this is, dramatically different between rural and urban, I think we talked before about, some of the differences we saw between like Philadelphia and other urban counties or the state. And there was actually a lot of consistency, but where there was a difference was especially with drug offenses that you saw in Philadelphia, especially, I think across the board, the sentences were lower and there was a greater use of alternatives like treatment courts and things like that. But the thing is, when you got to really large quantities of drugs, you almost did not see that in the smaller counties or the rural counties. You only saw it in Philadelphia. And so Philadelphia was like overrepresented in that. So I think those are just details that are really important to look at. And then I think the final override is the commission. I think, you have to look at this and say, do we trust the data for this assignment, or do we think sort of a policy decision should override that? And that's why I think that blended approach makes a lot of sense. That look, if there's 2,329 offenses, we're not going to go through all those assignments as a commission, right? But we can use it to sort of try to expedite a lot of this and bring it back in terms of like a first draft, and then say, are there things that just don't look right, or that you want us to look at more closely, or bring you other information? And I think one way of doing that is looking at categories of offenses. Like, for instance, if you have sentences for rape and for IDSI, and you see that they're really different, something's going on there, because traditionally they're in the same ballpark in terms of harm and in terms of culpability and things like that. You usually see those hang together in terms of the sentences you would expect. So if you got information back on medians that really separated them out, I think that'd be something you'd say, no, we have to look at that. Something's going on there. And I think there's going to be other examples just like that. I think you raised a really good point, but I'm still confident in the data.
Thank you.